What is up, guys? Today we got a great video here for you. We're going to be giving you 5 tips on how to build bigger arms with bands. All right, first and foremost, we are going to be focusing on tension or resistance. That's the biggest differentiator between free weights and bands, is how the force or resistance or tension, whatever you want to call it, is produced. So with free weights, it's very easy to generate tension because we have mass, right? So there's some weight here, some physical mass that's being pulled down to the ground from gravity. So you always have tension or force acting towards the center of the earth on whatever you're doing with free weights. And the only way that changes is when you're going through a range of motion and the angle between the free weight and your joint and gravity changes. That will slightly change the amount of tension you're putting on the muscle. With bands, it's totally different. So gravity is now out of the equation and there's no mass here. So what we're doing is we're stretching this band to produce tension. And the further that you stretch the band, the more tension that's produced. And there's a very wide variety of how you can set these bands up to create tension. You can have it just, singly stretched like this. You could fold it in half to produce more tension in a shorter duration or a shorter stretch length. So that's probably one of the biggest challenges, is setting this band up properly. So the most important part that I like to communicate with bands is making sure that you're setting up the proper range of tension throughout the range of motion. So let me show you what I'm talking about. With a band, you're always going to have a range of tension throughout the range of motion. So as I start out in this bicep curl, I have little to no tension at the bottom, and then as I sweep through, the band stretches further and further and further, and it creates peak tension at peak stress. The optimization point is setting up that range of tension. So like in this exercise, you can see the band at the bottom is loose. I have no tension here. And at the top, I have some tension, but ultimately like half of the range of motion, there's no tension. So the goal is to set it up so that you have tension throughout the entire range of motion, and you want to make sure that you have tension at the fully stretched position of the exercise. So in this bicep curl, we want that tension to pull our arm and pull this bicep into that fully lengthened position. And you can do that by taking up some slack on the band. This is just using the clench band handle, but so this will take up some slack. Now I have tension at the bottom of the rep, and as I sweep through, that tension increases and I get peak tension at the top of the rep. You don't need a clench band handle necessarily to do that. You can just change, where you're grabbing. So say I just loop this around, stepped on it with my other arm, and I'm gonna grab the band by itself. I can grab the band up here, or I can grab further down. The further you grab, or the more length that you take up, the more difficult it's gonna be. You just gotta be careful for overstretching. You don't wanna overstretch the band. All right, one thing I wanna set straight on tension is that in my perception of this industry, it seems like there's kind of 2 different camps that are developing. The one is, I only train with bands are superior, yada, yada, yada. Or the other one is, I'm this free weight guy and I do free weights and that's it. Ultimately, your muscles don't care about what they're being loaded with as long as they're being loaded. And from my perspective, my opinion, the goal here is to develop the most optimal strength or resistance profile for a given exercise. And there's certain exercises where, free weights are gonna be more optimal for a certain range of motion. There's certain exercises where bands are gonna be more optimal. But there's also a lot of cases where a combination of the 2 can produce an even better strength profile. For instance, in a bicep curl like this, with a free weight, I have, good tension here at the bottom. That mass is pulling my bicep into that fully lengthened position. But then as I sweep through, basically once I get past this 90-degree angle, that force actually starts to lessen because of the angle between my joints and gravity. So in this case, we could add basically a resistance band to this. You might need to do a little bit of tweaking here, but you can add a resistance band here. That'll give us good proper tension at the bottom, and then as we kind of sweep up through, the band force is increasing while the free weight force is decreasing, so that net force is a lot more constant, and you get peak force at the top of the rep at peak contraction. So I encourage you to not subscribe to one versus the other, but rather, how do I develop the strength profile to be the best for the muscle, no matter what tools that you're using. All right, tip number 2 is going to be form and execution. So we're training our arms, which relatively speaking are smaller muscle groups. So we want to try to isolate those muscle groups and force these small guys to grow as much as possible. And we do that by executing strict form and a solid, full range of motion. For example, with a bicep curl, we want to have good tension, solid tension at the bottom, stretching this muscle all the way out so we get a full stretch. And then when we go through the range of motion, we're keeping that elbow pinned to our side, humerus bone fixed, and then squeezing it all the way up so that you can feel this concentric portion of the rep and getting that peak contraction, driving it into the biceps. If you start moving your humerus around, doing stuff like this, we're getting shoulders involved, we're getting chest involved, we're not doing biceps. So make sure that when you're doing exercises, you're focusing on what you're trying to grow in that exercise. Same thing goes for a tricep extension or a push down. It's the same premise here. We put tension on here to get full stretch into the tricep, pinning that elbow into our side, and keeping that humerus bone as fixed as possible and driving it down all the way straight. So we're peak contraction, we're not stopping here because we have too much weight or something. You want to go all the way through, full stretch and full contraction at the bottom. So that brings us into point number 3, which is rep tempo and controlling the entire rep. So once you get the form mastered, there's also another component of the tempo, which means like how fast you're doing the rep and each component of the rep. So each rep has 3 components. You have the concentric phase, which is where you're basically contracting the muscle. And then you have the isometric phase, which is that peak contraction where you hold it. And then you also have the eccentric phase, which is where you are lengthening the muscle and controlling it. The biggest thing that I see here is people put tons of focus on the concentric and a lot of focus gets lost on the eccentric. So they're slamming it up and then they're letting it slingshot them back down and they're just cranking out reps. And it's like, well, I just went through the 3 phases of the rep. When you're doing this, you're only doing 1 phase of the rep. So you're missing out on 2/3 of the rep and 2/3 of the gains. And actually, the eccentric phase is where you're going to be the strongest. So in the concentric, you're contracting that muscle and you're squeezing it at the top. And then on the eccentric, you'll notice that you are actually stronger. So I could put a ton of weight on and you can lower it. You can lower more weight than you can raise. So when we do these reps, I like to focus on controlling the concentric. You want to try to move quickly and accelerate yourself on the way up. And then I always have some kind of a little pause for that isometric phase, just like a 1 to 2 second squeeze at the top of the rep. And then your eccentric, I usually like to do anywhere from 1 to 3 seconds on the eccentric and then change direction. So next tip number 4, we're gonna talk about volume. So when you're training arms, when you're training anything and you're trying to go for size, what you're trying to drive is something called hypertrophy, which is basically just increasing the volume of your muscle cells so that they are larger. And the big thing there is we are trying to force blood into these muscles and stretch them out and blow them up. That's why you hear people talking about the pump and getting pumped. And that's actually something you can feel while you're doing these exercises. As you go through, you're basically pumping blood into these muscles, pumping them up and stretching them out. And typically, the rep range and the set range for a given exercise, it's somewhere between 8 to 15 reps and 3 to 4 sets per exercise to kind of get to that peak pump or peak hypertrophy. And then there's things that you can do beyond that to help drive even more blood, more stuff, or more hypertrophy into that muscle group. And they're great techniques that you can do for arms. So things like supersets, where you do one exercise like a bicep curl, and then you jump into something else like a hammer curl immediately after that. So you basically just do like 2 consecutive sets from 2 different exercises. So that'll basically target 2 slightly different areas of a muscle group and pump them up beyond what you would normally do in a given set. Other things you can do is drop sets, where you start out with a heavy weight, and then once you can't do that heavy weight, you drop it down, do a lighter weight for some more reps, and then do another drop and do some lighter weight for more reps as well. That'll help force more blood into the muscle and give you more volume on that entire set. Final tip number 5, has to do with exercise selection and programming. We want to make sure that we're training all of the muscle groups in your arm so that you're building up all of those muscles to develop as much size as possible. So what that means is not all bicep curls are created equal, not all tricep pushdowns are created equal. We want to try to train all the different groups of the muscles. So like your bicep, it's got a long head, it's got a short head. Triceps got the same thing. It's actually got 3 heads. That's why it's called a tricep. And like you have other muscles in there, like your brachialis muscle, that kind of goes down the middle of the bicep. You got your brachioradialis, which goes down the forearm. You want to make sure that you're training all different muscles in your arm so that you're building them all up at the same time. And the way that you accomplish that is by doing different exercises. So like for your biceps, for instance, if you train with your arms, elbows out in front of you, that's going to be training the short head of the biceps. If you train with your elbows behind you, that trains the long head of the biceps. Changing your grip is a big thing that'll hit the brachialis, brachioradialis. So you can see when I'm in this neutral grip like this, the height of my bicep is longer. When I turn into that supination, you can see that bicep head just contracts right up, and then it also starts to get some of that brachialis muscle as well. If I do a reverse grip, you're gonna see a lot more of this brachioradialis come into play. So ultimately, when you're programming, make sure you're programming for the entire arm. All right, so there are my top 5 tips for how to get bigger arms with bands. And ultimately, this will apply to pretty much anything. These tips will. So hopefully you learned something today. If you have any questions, please drop them down in the comments below. Let me know what tip was your favorite. Also, if you want to see more content like this, be sure to click on these on-screen video links. We have tons of videos on this channel designed to help you get better. And also, if you need any resistance bands or accessories, please head over to clenchfitness.com and we will hook you up. Thank you so much for watching.